Now we're going to look at the topic of erythropoiesis, which is the process of hematopoiesis of erythrocytes. So it's looking specifically at the production of red blood cells. So as mentioned previously, hematopoiesis occurs in our red bone marrow. We make about 2 million red blood cells per second, which is an astounding number of cells. So this is a lot of cell building that's happening here, and it's going to require a ton of raw material. So a lot of your nutrients that you consume are going to be going to this process of making red blood cells, right? So it turns out red blood cells don't live very long. They last about 120 days, which is not very long for a cell, believe it or not. And we have to constantly replace them. And so we have to make lots of red blood cells every day, and they consume a lot of our raw materials. So they need glucose for energy. They're going to need lipids to build cell membranes, amino acids to build protein, vitamins and minerals to help these processes along, and of course, water, right? So I wanted to mention a few specific nutrients that are very sensitive for the process of erythropoiesis. So one of the obvious ones is iron, right? We know that we have to be consuming iron in our diet in order to make our red blood cells. So we need that iron as part of that heme group. The iron is what's carrying the oxygen. What's interesting is that we only absorb about 20% of the iron that we eat. This is very unusual. When we talk about the digestive system later, we're going to find out that the human digestive tract is a master at absorption, and we pretty much absorb like 100% of our nutrients with just a couple exceptions, right? Iron being one of them. So we have a hard time absorbing iron, mostly because iron is actually very toxic, and we have to be very careful about iron absorption and transport. So we need to make sure iron is in our diet. When we get the iron actually into our bloodstream, it's not initially just chucked right into a red blood cell. The iron is in our plasma attached to a transport protein called transferrin, which is a globulin protein. And the transferrin will transport the iron to our bone marrow, where it will be used to make red blood cells. Copper is another important nutrient for erythropoiesis. Copper is actually used to transport iron into the cells of our digestive tract, and it's actually used to convert the iron to a more usable form. So a lot of the iron that we're consuming, it's in a form that we can't use, and the copper actually tweaks it into a form of iron that we can use. Zinc is another important nutrient for erythropoiesis, and zinc is used in the process of making the heme groups for hemoglobin. Last is vitamin B. So vitamin B is actually a group of vitamins. It's not one vitamin. Folate and B12 are two types of B vitamins that are necessary for erythropoiesis. They're needed for the process of DNA production, DNA synthesis. So whenever you make new cells, you have to copy or synthesize DNA. And B12 and folate are B vitamins that are required in this process to produce DNA. What's interesting is that B12 actually requires a specific thing in order for us to absorb it in our digestive tract. So B12 requires something called intrinsic factor in order for us to absorb the B12. So some people that have a problem with the level of B12 in their body, the problem isn't that they're not consuming B12 in their diet. The problem is sometimes a lack of this intrinsic factor that's needed to bring it actually into the body. So now we can look at the process of erythropoiesis itself. So this is going to involve that hematopoietic stem cell. And basically, the stem cell is going to go through several divisions and differentiations. So divisions means to copy. Differentiation means to become more specific, more different than that starting stem cell. Eventually, the cell becomes what we call a reticulocyte. And reticulocytes are basically an immature form of a red blood cell. The process of erythropoiesis is mostly directed by hormones, and one really important hormone is called erythropoietin. It's better known by its abbreviation EPO. And a lot of you, this might sound familiar. because a lot of times they talk about this with athletes and like the Olympics and stuff like that. So like athletes can take artificial EPO and that'll help boost their number of red blood cells and they carry more oxygen, they can make more ATP, and I guess they're a better athlete. I don't know. Anyways, going back to the reticulocyte. The reticulocyte is the form of the red blood cell that is going to get dumped out of the bone marrow into the bloodstream. So the reticulocyte enters into your bloodstream and it still contains some of the remnants of the organelles, but eventually those organelles are degraded or ejected, as we talked about. Reticulocytes should comprise about 1 to 2% of the total erythrocyte count. So if someone's having a blood test done where they're going to count their red blood cells, about 1 to 2% of the red blood cells should actually be the reticulocytes. So the number of reticulocytes is important because it can indicate your ability to produce new red blood cells. So if they find out that your reticulocyte count is very low, that means you're having a problem making red blood cells for some reason. So I mentioned EPO, erythropoietin, as this hormone that's important for the process of erythropoiesis. So I want to talk a little bit more about this hormone. So like any hormone, this is a chemical messenger. It's released from one place, travels through the bloodstream, and goes to another place and exerts its effect at its target, okay? So the source of erythropoietin is actually your kidneys, which might sound very strange, but believe it or not, your kidneys are busybodies. They are actually watching all kinds of stuff that's going on in your body. They're watching your blood pressure. They're watching your oxygen levels. They are really into paying attention to what's going on with the circulatory system, right? The main job of your kidneys is to filter blood, so that's kind of why they're concerned with that. But anyways, so erythropoietin is made by your kidneys. Your kidneys have the ability to detect low oxygen, which is called hypoxia. So when your blood oxygen levels drop below a certain set point, you are hypoxic, and your kidney cells can detect this, and that's when they release the erythropoietin. The erythropoietin just travels through your bloodstream and it goes to the target, which is bone marrow, which makes sense because the EPO is going to cause the process of erythropoiesis. So the function of EPO is to increase the production of red blood cells. EPO is regulated through negative feedback mechanisms. So what that means is that hypoxia is what causes the release of EPO. So once your blood oxygen levels return to normal, then you will stop making the EPO. So a couple other things I want to talk about with regards to EPO are high altitude. I already talked about athletes, so I guess it's just one more thing I wanted to talk about. So as we go higher in altitude, the oxygen levels drop in the atmosphere. And of course, this results in hypoxia, and it will cause you to release EPO and make more red blood cells. So maybe you've heard that people that are like climbing mountains, a lot of times what they'll do is they'll climb to a certain elevation and then they'll stay there for a certain period of time. And this is actually to allow them to acclimate to that new altitude. What's happening is they're giving their body time to release the EPO, to make more red blood cells, so that they can carry enough oxygen to get to the next altitude on their mountain climb.